All right, good morning, friends, and welcome to the Conscious Contact meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. I am an alcoholic. My name is David. Good to see you all. Hold on, let me make sure I have my notes. Okay, and to start us off, our friend Linda is going to read the preamble. I just need to bring that up on the screen.
Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship of people who share their experience, strength, and hope with each other, that they may solve their common problem and help others to recover from alcoholism. The only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. There are no dues or fees for AA membership. We are self-supporting through our own contributions. AA is not allied with any sect, denomination, politics, organization, or institution, does not wish to engage in any controversy, neither endorses nor opposes any causes. Our primary purpose is to stay sober and help other alcoholics to achieve sobriety. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Okay, and now I'm going to ask if folks would like to join me in taking a moment for, excuse me, a moment of silence for the still sick and suffering alcoholic in and out of the room, followed by the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So welcome, friends. We are, as you know, most of you anyway, we are a line-by-line big book study. So what we do is we go quite slowly through the book, and what I found is throughout most of my AA career, when I've gone to big book meetings, we cover the whole chapter, and now we go a little bit more slowly. And what I find by doing that is that the text really opens up. And so one of the things we do also is as we go along, we'll categorize the text and really help open it up in terms of a reference tool that we can use when we're sharing the message. And here are the categories: and questions, directions and explanations, promises, warnings, and history. And the reason why that's different colors is questions get highlighted in, or at least according to how I do it. You can choose your own, but questions are orange, directions and explanations green, promises blue, warnings are pink, and history I just leave unhighlighted. And so we'll go through that today. As I mentioned, we are on page 80. We're near the top, not the very top, but close to the top of the page. I'm hoping we get about a page and a half in today. So because we've got two examples that are detailed in the today's reading. Just the format is I will share until about 7 o'clock or so, and then we'll open it up for questions. Also, FYI, my portion of the meeting today is going to be is being recorded, and the reason we do that is we post these on YouTube. And there's a link to our meeting archive in the chat if you want to check that out. And even though it's on YouTube, we just do the audio, no video, so we stay in line with the traditions. So we are, as I mentioned, on page 80, into action, and we're focusing now on the process of making direct amends, steps 8 and 9. And so today's reading goes further into the detail with the process of making amends. And the interesting thing really jumps out, or at least jumped out at me when I read this text to prepare for today, is I noticed something I never noticed before. Is that even though the process of doing amends is central to our recovery from alcoholism. The thing we might notice with today's text is that alcohol and drunkenness are barely mentioned. And in fact, the two instances we look at, in these, there's no clear indication that intoxication was a factor in the individual's harmful behavior. And so it may seem like, well, then why use these examples? And it's actually an important point because it illustrates the idea that, and you see this elsewhere in our text on page, I believe it's 103, bottles were only a symbol. And what it says is the examples today are clear indications that to fully recover from alcoholism, we have to clean up much more debris than just that caused by drinking. So through today's examples, we see that a much greater problem for us, or at least in my recovery, I found this to be so, much greater problem than just the drinking and the drunkenness has been the wreckage that I've created by living on a non-spiritual basis. And such wreckage is not always immediately apparent when we first get sober, and probably for good reason. But the longer I was sober, the more I realized, and I really recognized this when I did my first thorough fourth and fifth step, is that I would say probably 80% of what I did on that the things I wrote down were things that I did when I was stone cold sober, or I should say not drunk. I mean, I was not in recovery at that point, of course. So what many of us see, and what I saw, is that for many of us, the wrongs we committed only become apparent also when pointed out by a third party, such as one's sponsor or spiritual advisor. So while today's reading only mentions such third-party input in passing, we're going to see as we move forward in the text, we will continue to see how such direction and the input of a third party, such as a sponsor or spiritual director, plays an extremely important role if we are to continue to make sober progress. And so let's jump into the text and we'll go from there. So again, I'm at the top of page 80. Hopefully you have your book. And it starts with some explanation, just an introductory sentence, really. I highlighted it in green. This brings to mind a story about one of our friends. Now, the rest of the paragraph I've actually highlighted as a warning, because it really points to some problematic behavior. While drinking, he accepted a sum of money from a bitterly hated business rival, giving him no receipt for it. Okay, right there, let's think about this for a second. This is sort of the setup to the story, but one of the things I never really thought about until I got into the steps, until I started to work the steps my own. I just thought it was, okay, here's the setup, this is the situation, just a, kind of an unfortunate situation, and I thought, as I got into the steps, though, as the steps played a larger and larger influence in my life, the thing I realized, okay, bitterly hated business rival. There is a whole encyclopedia of character defects tangled up in that phrase. And so already we see that we're going to assume that by the time the person got to the amends process, there had been some work in the nature of this bitter hate. And the fact of giving him no receipt for it. Again, another problem, probably interlaced with character defects that hopefully would have been detailed in the fourth and the fifth step. So, and he says, and again, at the beginning of the sentence, it says while drinking. However, here's the thing. It's not really clear to me, and you could debate it, it's not really clear to me if Bill means this incident took place during his drinking life or he was drunk at the time. See, it's unclear, and I think it's ambiguous for a good reason, because I think the point that we're going to see is that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. He subsequently denied having received the money and used the incident as a basis for discrediting the man. He thus used his own wrongdoing as a means of destroying the reputation of another. His own wrongdoing being that he didn't give a receipt for the money received. So basically the assumption is our friend, the alcoholic, likely he publicly claimed that the business rival never repaid him or gave him money for some good or service. And so, in fact, his rival was ruined. Okay. Now, the next 4 lines in the next paragraph they continue with a warning. He felt he had done a wrong he could not possibly make right. And I don't know, I mean, I certainly am not going to ask for a show of hands on this, but we can just ask ourselves in our own heart, when we came into AA, were there wrongs we committed that we thought we could never set right, that were so egregious? And might be the case, but I hate to think so, that I'm the only alcoholic who carried wrongs into my sobriety that I thought were just so ugly and messy and confusing, quite frankly, that I could never set it right. And so what I did when I first got here was I buried it. I just sort of took it under those a category of wrongs and wreckage that could never be dealt with, so why bother thinking of it? But we'll see why we should think about it in a moment. If he opened the old affair, he was afraid it would destroy the reputation of his partner, disgrace his family, and take away his means of livelihood. And and that is a warning. And why do I have it in warning? I have it in warning because I'm going to, and again, it's not explicit, but I'm going to be assuming. I'm going to be assuming that this fear is being generated while he's in sobriety now. So he's in recovery and he has fear. And again, he's experiencing what the world may deem as a natural response. But what we as alcoholics would say is a response rooted in a character defect. And the character defect here being the fear. And it may almost seem like it's justified fear. But we're going to see something a little different. So the next 3 lines in this paragraph, we close out the paragraph with 2 questions. First, What right had he to involve those dependent upon him? It's a good point. Second, how could he possibly make a public statement exonerating his rival? And it's a very complex situation, to be sure. So how was it handled? Let's see. And here is the next, I guess, 3 lines or so. I have, which is it looks like a lengthy sentence, as a promise. And I'll explain why in a moment. After consulting with his wife and partner, he came to the conclusion that it was better to take those risks than to stand before his Creator guilty of such ruinous slander. Okay. I have this as a promise. Now, it may not seem like, ooh, isn't this great? He gets to admit his wrong. But the promise is, through a life of sober living, we develop a conscience, first of all. And second of all, is that through that conscience, by asking for guidance, we find we are able to chart a path forward, one step at a time, one day at a time, through seemingly complex or unsolvable problems. God will reveal to us step by step what we need to do, even if He doesn't reveal the entire solution from the beginning. The other thing that we see here, this isn't so much a promise as a theme we're going to see throughout today's reading. And that is this contrast or difference between worldly values versus spiritual values. And one of the things that I found is that it was really easy for me to be sober a very long time and still live my life according to mostly worldly values. And then wonder why there was still conflict in my life and why there was this underlying depression that I struggled with in my life. And what I realized is I was living the way most people around me. I thought the purpose of AA was to be restored to the quote-unquote firing line of life. But it was only when I started to study the text, the big book, on a line-by-line basis, did it become clear to me that I was being called to a higher standard than just to be restored to the life everyone else was living. So, moving forward, he saw that he had to place the outcome in God's hands, or he would soon start drinking again, and all would be lost anyhow. And what I encountered in my own life, thank God I did not drink and I did not end up with a drink in my hand, let's put it that way. But I have seen a number of people over the decades that I've been here, I've seen a number of people attempt to live by worldly values in our program, continue to run into conflict. And then what happens is that AA either becomes increasingly irrelevant in their life, boring, or actually painful and emotionally painful because they're in such emotional conflict. And so they stop coming to meetings. So he attended church, and this is all a promise. In fact, this entire paragraph is a promise. He attended church for the first time in many years. After the sermon, he quietly got up and made an explanation. His action met with widespread approval. And today, he is one of the most trusted citizens of his town. This all happened years ago. I'm just going to put a quick question and a public service announcement out there. I tried to, because usually when I read a story like this, what I try to do is do a little research and find out who did Bill base this on, what was the incident, and for the life of me, and I have some websites that I go to that are they're not directly AA websites, but they're affiliated. And I couldn't find any background info on this story. So if anybody knows the background or runs into it, please forward that to me, because I'd love to know the real story behind this. So moving on. So that's the end of the first example. And now we're going to run into a more generalized example. And it starts, the first two sentences are warnings. The chances are we have domestic troubles. And of course, he's being sort of general here. He's sort of being, you might even say, a little ironic or minimizing, because as we see, it's a little bit more than just domestic troubles. Perhaps we are mixed up with women in a fashion we wouldn't care to have advertised. The thing that I think is interesting here is the difference. We already see a difference between these two examples, and I think the difference is important in that we recognize both things are valid. One, our first example starts with while drinking, so there's an assumption where these problems took place back when he was drinking. Notice some of the verbs here. The chances are that we have doesn't say we had. So here's my point. There's not an indication that this started. Well, it may have started while the person was drinking, but there's a clear indication that the problem is still ongoing because it's in the present tense. Perhaps we are, doesn't say we were, it says we are. Perhaps we are mixed up with women in a fashion we wouldn't care to have advertised. And then explanation, one sentence of explanation. We doubt if, in this respect, alcoholics are fundamentally much worse than other people. Okay. And again, that actually goes back to that thing, sober values or spiritual values versus worldly values. Right. This is something that a lot of people, drunk or alcoholic or non-alcoholic, encounter. But the point that we're going to see is that as alcoholics, to stay sober, we have to respond to these situations differently. And then we've got several sentences of warnings. But drinking does complicate sex relations in the home. After a few years with an alcoholic, a wife gets worn out, resentful, and uncommunicative. How could she be anything else? The husband begins to feel lonely, sorry for himself. So already we've got another indication of character defects, of the alcoholic's behavior. I don't have the direct quote, but gang, remember that part where it says it's set in selfishness, self-centeredness. That's our whole problem. And also where it talks about fears and setting in motion trains of circumstance that we felt we did not deserve. So the husband begins to feel lonely, sorry for himself. But the thing that we need to recognize is who set these trains of circumstance in motion. Well, we can say that the alcoholic's behavior played a clear role in that. He commences to look around in the nightclubs or their equivalent for something besides liquor. Besides, he is having a secret and exciting affair with the girl who understands. That's all warning. And now we go into a question. In fairness, we must say that she may understand. But what are we going to do about a thing like that? It's sort of an awkward question, but it means, okay, we've got this situation. Maybe she does understand. But we're married. And there may be children involved. And how do we handle this? And then we close out the paragraph with explanation. A man so involved often feels very remorseful at times, especially if he is married to a loyal and courageous girl who has literally gone through hell for him. Whatever the situation, and then actually the first sentence is direction. Whatever the situation, we usually have to do something about it. And then a question. If we are sure our wife does not know, should we tell her? And then explanation or direction. Not always, we think. And then one more question. If she knows in a general way that we have been wild, should we tell her in detail? And then the rest of the paragraph is direction and explanation. Undoubtedly, we should admit our fault. She may insist on knowing all the particulars. She will want to know who the woman is and where she is. We feel we ought to say to her that we have no right to involve another person. We are sorry for what we have done, and God willing, it shall not be repeated. I'm just going to pause there for a second. This notion of God willing, it will not be repeated. I sort of had a problem with that sentence for years because it felt like the man was saying, I did this horrible, selfish thing, and if the stars will allow it, it's not going to happen again. And it almost seems like he's avoiding responsibility for ensuring that it doesn't happen again. And I think what he is saying, though, I think what they're really saying, though, I don't think they're saying that. I think what they're saying is that because it is only through God's grace that I am sober, So, God willing, I can stay sober. This will not happen again. And again, that's just my interpretation. Some may see it differently. More than that, we cannot do. We have no right to go further. Though there may be Though there may be justifiable exceptions, and though we wish to lay down no rule of any sort, we have often found this the best course to take. I think the key thing, and then that closes out our reading today, I think the key thing here is to recognize that even though they don't talk about the input of a sponsor and a spiritual advisor directly, I think that input and that influence is absolutely critical. And so I'm going to open it up, but what I want to do, I put out some questions there, and because I think it really focuses what we're reading today. So I'd like to share those. And that is, the first question is, when approaching the amends process, was I surprised to realize that I had committed wrongs that could not be blamed on drunkenness? And how did I respond to such realizations? Question 2. In repairing such wrongs, how was the input or direction of a sponsor or spiritual advisor? How has the input or direction of a sponsor or spiritual advisor influenced my course of action? What difference has such input played? And 3, today's reading illustrates the troubles that can arise from our attempts to live by, quote, worldly values instead of spiritual values. What challenges have I encountered in my efforts to leave worldly values behind and there's a typo there, and live according to AA's spiritual principles. So with that, we will